Hey guys, it's Shawn. Let's talk about conversions of entities. Now, if you're poking your head around, you probably were searching for the word conversion. A lot of people don't even know this tool exists, but it's exciting for business law nerds like myself and probably might be something you're considering for your business. So, we're going to talk about conversions. We're going to talk about what they do, how they work. We'll get you familiar with them, and then you can use that tool to power along. Feel free, as always, to join me in the comments if you have specific questions. I can't do legal advice through YouTube, but if I see a theme and a general question, I can answer that. Speaking of which, this will not be specific legal advice for your situation. We're just going to talk generally about the statutes and laws. Consult your legal advisor. Also, this is not financial or investment advice. The conversion tool is a powerful, newer tool. It's been around for a while, and basically what it allows you to do is take one type of entity and change it to another type of entity without necessarily ending the legal life of the prior entity and continuing the business as it goes. So in the old days, and I mentioned this is a newer tool, in the old days, what you would have to do is move the entity through a merger, or maybe even in some cases back in the day, you would have to dissolve an entity and reform an entity in a different state if you wanted to move from one state to another. Or if you had an LLC and you wanted to be a corporation, you would probably have to do some type of merger or other transaction to get changed. Well, the states started getting smart and they started adding these conversion statutes, which are a wonderful thing and it's powerful. And what you do is you take your existing entity, whatever state, whatever type of entity, and then you convert it into the other state's whatever type of entity you want. So let's say you have an LLC, you want to now become a Delaware corporation. Through the conversion process, you can just move that entity from being an LLC in one state to being a corporation in Delaware. And maybe you need this. Maybe your investor is saying, hey, I'll invest money in you, but I expect you to be a Delaware corporation, right? There are a lot of times this could come up. Or maybe you've just learned that a different form of entity is going to be better for you and your business, right? So it's a newer tool, it's a powerful tool. Let's take a look at the Delaware statute here, which will teach us a lot about it. So this is the Delaware statute. We'll talk later, different states, different rules. So you've got to look at the conversion statute generally in two states, the state you're coming from and the state you're going to. And a lot of people are going to be going to Delaware. Generally, as you grow, sometimes you'll end up with an investor or other person who requests Delaware. And usually that's just because of familiarity and a little more certainty with the law. So if somebody says, hey, you need to be a Delaware corporation, and you're considering conversion as your strategy, here's the conversion statute. Pretty simple, right? Basically says if you're some type of entity and you want to become a corporation, this is what you want to do. The other entity, we're looking at 260, this is Delaware Code, we're looking at section 265B. You have to comply with this section, including subsection H. We'll talk about that in a minute. And file with the Secretary of State both a certificate of conversion to a corporation and a certificate of incorporation. So the way Delaware does these conversions is you file both the certificate of conversion and then you basically file almost like a new company with Delaware, a new certificate of incorporation in the case of corporation, or certificate of formation in the form of an LLC. We're looking at the corporate statute on this, but Delaware basically says file a certificate of conversion and then basically file like a new company. You file those simultaneously. And they can either be effective upon filing, or they can have a future effective date or time, and they have to both be the same. Now, we're going to talk about this here in a minute. This is an important piece of this, is to understand the effective time of the conversion, especially if you have a multi-state deal going on here. Subsection C of 265 of the Delaware General Corporation Law tells us what needs to be in the certificate of conversion. And then I start talking about the legal effect, right? And this is what's great. E doesn't by Delaware law deem to affect any obligations or liabilities of the entity, right? So you have assets, you have liabilities, you're running in business, and now you're going to convert. Well, the last thing you want to do is trigger loan defaults or have to redo all your liabilities with your creditors. Now, you're going to have to look at your contracts. You may have a contractual issue. It may say something about if you convert or change your entity, that something happens under your contractual obligations. But as a matter of at least Delaware law, they're saying your obligations and liabilities continue. So this is a great outcome for the business owner because now suddenly you've just converted to another state, and you don't have to go back and redo everything. You are essentially, for Delaware law purposes, the same continuing entity, right? And then basically, yeah, F reinforces that. It says when another entity has been converted into a corporation estate, shall be, for the purposes of the laws of Delaware, the same entity as the converting entity. So Delaware is now doubling down. Not only do the liabilities and obligations transfer, but they're saying basically you're the same entity in the eyes of Delaware. So, before you were an LLC in another state, you did this conversion process, and now suddenly you're a Delaware corporation. They're saying for Delaware law purposes, we're going to view you as being the same company. And then they're saying, unless otherwise agreed for all purposes of Delaware law and applicable non-Delaware law. Because remember, if you're moving from another state, you're going to have two laws in play here. We'll talk about that in a minute. The converting entity shall not be required to wind up its affairs, so you're keeping rolling here. And you're not a dissolution, right? So it's the same entity you're keeping moving. Talks about approval. Obviously, if you're going to do some type of corporate transaction, some type of business transaction, you got to get approved on your applicable documents. H. That would be applicable under whatever law you're currently under prior to being a Delaware corporation, right? Whatever internal governance you have that would be required to authorize a conversion would have to be done, whether that's a board approval, shareholder approval, et cetera, based on your documents. Certificate of conversion has to be signed by the person who's authorized to sign it. That makes perfect sense. And then you're saying here, it can be all the stock and securities can be transferred too, right? So you're not only are you moving all the assets and liabilities, but you're moving the ownership as well. And again, this is going to have to be authorized in the manner required by the governing documents of the entity. So you see why this is such a powerful tool, because you don't have to wind up the entity. You don't have to change the entity. In fact, Delaware law is saying it's the same entity. This really streamlines things. The old days, you had to figure out a way to do this. And a lot of times that would be a merger. The merger statutes have been around a lot longer, and you could merge a entity into another one. So you would form the entity you want to end up as, and then you would take the entity you currently have and you would merge the two together. And through that process of merger, you would force the outcome of getting moved to the state you wanted to go to, right? So a little bit more cumbersome process, more likely to trigger some legal issues than a conversion, and not as clean and simple, right? This is a one line. You're just moving from one state to the other through a couple of filings. Different states, different rules. We just examined in detail the Delaware statute. The other statutes are going to have different requirements, and they're going to have different formats of information you need to include. So what you're generally going to end up doing is filing two certificates of conversion in two states, and then you're going to end up moving the entity from one entity to one state to another. And so as part of that process, you've got to get this cleared in both states. You'll generally want similar filings, similar contents, but you'll need different requirements and different inputs. So you got to look at both statutes, and this is where it gets a little bit complex. The other thing you want to consider here is pre-filing in both states, because you'll want to do this conversion and you want to make sure you get out of the old state and into the new state. Let's say you file your documents in Delaware, and Delaware takes them, no problem, administratively processes the filing, and then you file in your sending jurisdiction, and for some reason they get rejected, right? The Secretary of State didn't like how you worded something, they're not happy with the different provisions, they reject you. Well, now you're stuck in the middle, right? You didn't make it out of your old state, and now supposedly your business is set up in your new state. You can see how that would be a real mess. The way to do this that's safest is to set up both filings, put in a future effective date, And then states generally have a way where you can get a filing pre-cleared with the state. It costs money, but you take the filing to the state, you show them what you're going to do, you get them to approve it in advance. They give it the stamp of approval. Then you would file both of those pre-cleared with the same time at the bottom for effectiveness. That way you're sure that the process is going to go through on both states. That's a little bit more complicated, but it gives you that certainty of not getting hung up in the middle and being in a weird legal situation. Aside from that, the other multi-state issue comes up is when you transfer this entity. Delaware law says you're converted for purposes of Delaware law. Other laws will say generally similar language. You'll see that similar language in other conversion statutes. But then you have to deal with things like payroll tax accounts, sales tax accounts, all of that. That may not convert over as cleanly. So you're going to have to go back and look at all your filings, all your compliance, of course, your insurance and all that. So you may have a lot of updates to do to carry it out on the back end. But the front end of just getting the entity moved from one state to another is pretty simple. And there's still going to be cleanup to do, right? After you do all this, obviously, all this filings, cleanups, etc. So let's bring this all together for today, folks. Conversion is a powerful, powerful tool to have, and it's something you should always be aware of, at least at the minimum. And it may be something specifically you're considering for your entity. It is really the cleanest way, if there's not some other method, to move an entity, either type of entity or state of formation. So if you can do it, if you have conversion statutes available in both states, it is really simpler than possibly doing a merger. It also is more streamlined, and it really is set up to do just this, to do the conversion. A merger was really set up for something else, to combine two business entities. So it's a very powerful tool. It's in your back pocket. If you have questions about it, comments, drop them below. I will look at the audience feedback. However, I can't answer your specific legal questions. We can't give legal advice through the forum of YouTube. And also, you shouldn't be putting anything confidential down there anyway. So don't put any confidential information in the comments. But hopefully this is a powerful tool for you. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up, and please subscribe to the channel and ring the bell for notification if you're interested in these business law type issues. Thanks for joining me today.